Hello and welcome to History House. I'm your host Owen Delaney. Let's begin. Today we will be looking at some of the most extraordinary pieces of art from the ancient world, the Faiyum Mummy Portraits. My logic behind this was, given that it is Christmas time as I'm recording this, and given that the story behind it comes from the Middle East, the same neck of the woods as we would say in Ireland, I felt that it would be appropriate to do an episode from the same region. That, and the fact that these works of art date from roughly the same period as the time of Jesus, I thought it would be fascinating to talk about these portraits as they are, in effect, time capsules, to how life and society was like during this era. In Egypt, not Judea, although according to the Bible, Jesus, Mary and Joseph and the donkey fled to Roman Egypt to avoid King Herod. So in short, this episode will provide a snapshot to art, society, religion and literary influences stemming from Egypt around the time of Jesus Christ. The quote in the episode title, "Rise up to life, for you have not died," comes from a translation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, an ancient funerary text dating from around 1550 BC to around 50 BC. It contains spells to help the deceased individual as they went through their journey into the afterlife, and I felt that this quote was an appropriate description for these funerary portraits. For while the individuals may have died millennia ago, these images allow for their memory, while they were alive, to live on thousands of years later, as we will see. In the first part of the episode, I will be talking about these portraits, their historical context, and the history of their discovery, before looking at what they can tell us about the society of Graeco-Roman Egypt in the second part, along with their possible influence on Oscar Wilde in his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. So without any further ado, let's begin. To start, I think that a background to Egypt of the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD is necessary. After millennia of various kingdoms and foreign domination, including Assyrian and Persian, the land of Egypt fell under the control of Alexander the Great and his empire. He himself would found the city of Alexandria in 331 BC, which would become the capital of his successors, and for a time the largest city in the ancient world. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals, who fought amongst each other for power, with Ptolemy I Soter receiving Egypt and his dynasty ruling the kingdom until 30 BC, when it was conquered by the Roman Empire. Under the rule of the Ptolemies, as the dynasty became known as, Alexandria became a great centre of Greek culture, with some of the most well-known sites of the ancient world, including the Lighthouse of Pharos, the Great Library, and the tomb of Alexander the Great being built there. I hope to do an episode in the future of Alexandria during this time, so I won't delve too much into the city, its history and famous locations, but for the purpose of this particular show, the important thing to know was that Alexandria, as a Greek city, acted as a conduit by which Greek, Hellenistic culture spread across the kingdom, creating in many respects a hybrid Hellenistic Egyptian culture. This is best evidenced in the area of religion, in which the Ptolemies encouraged the cult of Serapis, a syncretic god who incorporated elements from Osiris, the Egyptian god of the dead, as well as the features of the Greek pantheon. On the one hand, his appearance appears like a deity, like Zeus, making him seem Hellenistic. However, he is typically portrayed with a modius on his head, a crown often associated with power in ancient Egypt. While it is difficult to say how much the syncretic god penetrated the belief system of ordinary people, among the upper class, it is suffice to say that it had some impact, while one of the Faiyum Mummy Portraits, which I will discuss soon, was clearly a priest of Serapis, as evidenced by his 7-pointed star headdress, which was worn by the elders of Serapis. Alongside the cult of Serapis, there does seem to be an incorporation of the ancient Egyptian pantheon into the ritual and worship of the Greeks in Ptolemaic and later Roman Egypt. For example, a shroud from the Ptolemaic dynasty depicts a man in the centre wearing what is clearly Greek-inspired fashion, with the gods of Osiris and Anubis to his right and left respectively, two figures in ancient Egyptian legend associated with death and the process of embalming. It is the process of embalming, or as we know it, creating mummies, that would over time be incorporated into the funerary process of at least some of the Greeks in Egypt, with their own take in the form of the Faiyum Mummy Portraits. So how were they discovered? Well, before examining this, we need to understand the political context of Egypt in the 19th century. Since 1517, Egypt belonged to the Ottoman Empire, but over the course of the following centuries, Ottoman direct control faded to the extent that while the land was nominally governed from Constantinople, local rulers, in effect, governed the territory in practice. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 further destabilised the territory, alongside spurring European interest in ancient Egypt with discoveries such as the Rosetta Stone and a dynasty of rulers founded by Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, governing the territories first as governors, walis, and from 1867 as khedives, viceroys. Ottoman rule remained only nominal, and it was during the rule of this dynasty that European involvement in Egypt would grow, as demonstrated by the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. This interference reached a crescendo when, after the deposing of the British-backed ruler Khedive Tewfik in 1881, the Royal Navy proceeded to bombard the port of Alexandria the following year, culminating in the restoration of Tewfik and the beginning of the unofficial occupation of Egypt by the British, a period in Egyptian history called the Shadow Protectorate. I hear you asking, how does this have to do with mummy portraits from thousands of years ago? Well, it turns out, quite a lot. While there were certainly archaeological digs in Egypt before 1882, unofficial British control over the land meant that British archaeologists had increased access to ancient Egyptian sites, ensuring that some of the most important discoveries of ancient Egypt of the late 19th to early 20th century were made by British archaeologists. The discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun by Howard Carter in 1922 is probably the best example of this. Of interest to us is the archaeologist Sir Flinders Petrie. Petrie was born in 1853 and was largely self-taught in archaeology, surveying prehistoric sites in Britain before travelling to Egypt for the first time in 1880. He would conduct a survey of the pyramids in Giza before receiving backing from the Egypt Exploration Fund, now the Egypt Exploration Society, to excavate sites in Egypt. Beginning in early 1888, Petrie began excavating the site of Hawara, uncovering what became known as the Faiyum Mummy Portraits. While uncovered in Hawara, other discoveries of these portraits, including in the Roman city of Antiopolis, founded by the Emperor Hadrian for his lover Antinous, were located in the wider Fayum Basin to the southwest of Cairo. While it is true to say that some mummy portraits were discovered as early as 1615 by the traveller Pietro della Valle, Petrie's discovery was the first to use what we would call modern archaeological methods to uncover these mummy portraits, describing these discoveries using scientific analysis. The late 1880s to early 1890s were also a very different time from 1615, in that the popular media, in the form of newspapers, now existed, ensuring that there was extensive coverage of Petrie's findings in the Egyptian Hall in London from June to July of 1888, including reviews and an influence on contemporary literature, which will be discussed later. Owing to Petrie's status as a British national and the backing he received from the Egypt Exploration Fund, many of these portraits ended up in institutions such as the British Museum and the Petrie Museum, which houses the artefacts he uncovered over his career. But later discoveries of mummy portraits found their ways to museums in Paris, Berlin, New York, Athens, and within Egypt itself, among many other places. The Appear Project, an initiative of the Getty organisation, has a full list of the various locations of these paintings, as well as in-depth info into the study of these portraits. It's definitely worth checking out, not only to find the nearest Faiyum portrait to you, but also for in-depth research about them, and I will include a link to the project in the description. So, we have gone from Alexander the Great to ancient Egyptian funerary practices, and from European interference in Egypt to the public sensation that these portraits created when they were exhibited in London. Quite a lot, if you ask me. So, I think we'll take a short break, and afterwards we'll look at the historical significance of these mummies and their influence on the famed Irish writer and wit Oscar Wilde. See you all soon. Welcome back. Before the break, we examined Ptolemaic/Roman Egypt, its political and religious environment, the Shadow Protectorate of Egypt, Sir Flinders Petrie, and his discovery of a large cache of the Faiyum Mummy Portraits. Now, we'll be taking a deeper dive into these portraits, what they're made of, the stories behind some of the people depicted, and their possible influence on literature of the time. One of the most important points to note about the Faiyum Mummy Portraits is that they demonstrate the penetration of certain elements of Greek culture into areas overwhelmingly inhabited by non-Greeks, given that the Fayum Basin is far away from the Hellenistic centre of Alexandria. This can not only be seen in the attire of the various individuals that they depict, but also in religious matters. One of these portraits depicts a man with folding doors shown, with not only the goddess of Isis, the wife of Osiris, and whose cult spread beyond Egypt and across the Roman Empire, but also the god Serapis, who was mentioned in the first part. Indeed, another mummy is believed to be a priest of Serapis, owing to his wearing of a seven-starred headdress, which was a form of attire worn by high religious officials of this faith. We also know a great deal about the creation of these portraits, the materials used, and how the painting was made. The Appear Project, which was mentioned in the first part, not only traces the locations of these works, but also has analysed their composition, which has revealed details that written sources cannot provide, and its findings have been published in Mummy Portraits of Roman Egypt, emerging research from the Appear Project. Most of the paintings, 69.4%, were created on imported European limewood, reflecting Roman Egypt's connections with the wider empire, although wood from native Egyptian trees, including fig, cedar, and tamarisk, accounted for 15.6% together. With regards to pigments used for colouring, madder, derived from the rubia plant, and its red colour, was used for drapery, stripes and garments, lips and facial highlights. Further, Egyptian blue was often mixed with other pigments in these portraits, and green pigments and indigo have also been detected upon analysing these works, as well as layering and egg coating in the case of paintings found in the National Museum of Denmark. Unfortunately, in many of these portraits, we don't have a name for the individual shown. When many of the mummy portraits were discovered early on, the mummies were often separated from the paintings, meaning that even with the advancement of technology, it is impossible to scan the mummy itself and compare it with the portrait of the individual. There are, however, some exceptions to this. We know for certain one of the names of the mummies, Artemidorus, as he is one of the few mummies which has their portrait still attached. His coffin depicts the Egyptian gods Horus, Thoth, and Anubis, and the inscription in Greek reads, quote, Artemidorus, farewell. Well wishes for his soul as he ventured into the afterlife. The portrait, which I've included in the social media links, depicts a young man of around 20 with a laurel wreath on his head and dates from approximately the reign of Trajan, reigned 98 to 117 AD. While we don't know much about this man beyond his name and image, there is no doubt of the profound importance of this image. Here is Artemidorus, a man who died nearly 2,000 years ago, gazing back at us in an image that looks like it was painted a few centuries ago, with a realism that you would not expect for something created millennia in the past. We mentioned before the media frenzy surrounding the exhibiting of these portraits in London, and on top of this, these portraits could well have had an influence on one of the most recognised novels in the English language. According to the late Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat, Oscar Wilde was inspired by Egypt and by extension the Faiyum Mummy Portraits. For one, Wilde's father, Sir William Wilde, visited Egypt and wrote about his travels in his work, Narrative of a Voyage to Madeira, Tenerife, and along the shores of the Mediterranean in 1840, so it is possible that son was influenced by father in terms of interest to this land. For Oscar personally, he was a student of J.P. Mahaffy, a noted classicist at Trinity College Dublin, so given the Greco influence on Egypt following Alexander the Great, it is perhaps natural that Wilde would be interested in the Faiyum Mummy Portraits at the same time as they were being discovered. Crucially, Montserrat also notes that Wilde was present in London in the summer of 1888 during an exhibition of Petrie's excavated portraits. While the evidence for Wilde visiting the show is circumstantial, it is very likely that Wilde was aware of it. For one, a close friend of Oscar, Johnson Forbes Robertson, wrote a review of the exhibition and, as Montserrat writes, quote, an exhibition promising images of languid Greek youths with a glint in their eye, suggested by the seductive write-up in the Illustrated London News, would have an obvious appeal for Wilde as classicist, aesthete, and homosexual. End quote. Further, when Oscar Wilde was imprisoned in Reading jail for, quote, gross indecency, one of the books he requested was, quote, one of Petrie's works on ancient Egypt. In terms of the picture of Dorian Gray itself, there are clear references to same-sex desire, classical beauty, and Egypt, as seen by the following quote when the artist Sir Basil Hallward describes Dorian's beauty, quote, I had drawn you as Paris in dainty armour, and as Adonis with huntsman's cloak and polished spear. Crowned with heavy lotus blossoms, you had sat on the prow of Hadrian's barge, gazing across the green turbaned Nile. End quote. Paris and Adonis were classical figures of the Trojan War, and the lover of the Greek god Aphrodite, respectively. Crucially, though, comes the quote about Hadrian and the Nile, which is a reference to Antinous, the previously mentioned lover of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who died in the River Nile while on a trip with him in the year 130 AD. Indeed, a more direct reference to the Faiyum Mummy Portraits comes from the fact that other exhibitions in the Egyptian Hall, where these works were exhibited, are referenced in the picture of Dorian Gray itself. While some of this evidence is circumstantial, I think that when we place all these pieces together and consider their preservation in the Egyptian desert across centuries, a clear parallel with Dorian, who remains youthful while his painting gets old and ugly over time, with each sin he commits, it is fair to say that the Faiyum Mummy Portraits were an influence on Oscar Wilde, especially for his only novel. On a side note, I also explored the influence of John Senior Sargent on the same work in episode 6, Please check it out for more. Over time, the funerary rites that accompanied these portraits began to stop. Egypt, and particularly Alexandria, was one of the oldest centres of Christianity, and over the centuries it became more practised in the community, until it was given toleration across the empire with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, followed by its status as the official religion of the Roman Empire in 390 AD. This elevated position that Christians found themselves in was a reversal of centuries of persecution, and in some ways they became the persecutors of pagans, with the Serapeum in Alexandria, the principal site of worship of Serapis, being destroyed in 391 AD by a Christian mob. I don't want to delve too much on this, as I hope to do an episode in the future of ancient Alexandria, but it is suffice to say that any syncretic pagan beliefs were driven underground and eventually died out. These portraits, however, had stopped being produced by the end of the 200s AD, possibly owing to the political crisis that the Roman Empire found itself in during the century, the crisis of the 3rd century as it became known as, or the religious tensions between pagans and Christians that became apparent around this time. In any case, these mummies would gradually be forgotten to history, abandoned in the desert, which ironically would help preserve and protect their condition over the centuries, before they were rediscovered by archaeologists, such as Sir Flinders Petrie. To conclude, the Faiyum Mummy Portraits are incredibly important finds in the area of ancient/classical history. According to the Greek artist Euphrosyne Doxiadis, in the introduction of her work, The Mysterious Faiyum Portraits, Faces from Ancient Egypt, these works are, quote, the most outstanding body of painting to have come down to us from the ancient world. If we are to take this remark at face value, then these would also be the earliest works in human history to depict humans in a realistic manner that has been handed down to us. Personally, I try to show history as something not far removed from the present, in that the decisions of the past still affect society today. I also try to demonstrate that the people of the past were not so different from individuals today. While it is relatively easy to apply this label for people who lived 50 years ago, 75 years ago, and to some extent 100 years ago, anything beyond a century ago becomes increasingly difficult to relate to, let alone 2,000 years ago. Yet, when one looks at these individuals across various museums around the world, it dawns on you that these were real people. They had their lives, families, religious practices, professions, and yes, dreams. In some ways, they are not dissimilar to a selfie of a person on a smartphone or on social media, that when they pass away, they maintain some immortality in that their image stays the same in the digital world. The one key difference is that these individuals have maintained a physical eternity in a land and region that has unfortunately been plagued by war and disasters across the centuries. It is also in this area of the world that over hundreds of years the memories of places, individuals, and their peoples have been extinguished in the context of war and displacement. Given that this plight is something that also plagues the world of today, and the retention of memory can sometimes be complicated even in the digital age, perhaps the Faiyum Mummy Portraits can offer some hope. For it is by the mere act of viewing them that we remember these individuals who lived not just centuries ago, but over a millennia in the pages of history. That's all for today. The next episode, released in January, is going to be a special one, in that for the first time I will be joined by a guest, my good friend Salvatore Salvo Zito, originally from Sicily, but very much an Irishman at heart. He will be joining me to discuss some historical and cultural aspects of his hometown, Catania, and the island of Sicily as a whole, a land that's had its fair share of peoples, from Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, and many more, across millennia. It's sure to be a good one, so I hope you can join me and Salvo for this fascinating episode. I'm also going to take the time to outline my provisional plan for next year, up until May. Aside from my collaboration with Salvo in January, I plan on releasing a special Valentine's Day episode on the figure of Anarkali, a legendary woman from Mughal India whose supposed secret romance with the future Emperor Jahangir would prove to stand the test of time, being portrayed time and time again in Indian cinema. For March, I plan on visiting Stockholm for an instalment on Queen Christina of Sweden, born in 1626, reigned from 1632 to 1654, and died in 1689, one of the most extraordinary women of her time, commonly referred to as the Minerva of the North, on account of her patronage of the arts, Minerva being the Roman goddess of wisdom. On top of that, she lived what can be described as an unconventional lifestyle, and her private life, much like my previous episode on John Senior Sargent, has been much debated by historians, so I hope to do justice to this incredible individual, who is not as well known as I feel she should be. April's episode, on account of it timing with the cherry blossom season in Japan, will be about the Yoshiwara district in Edo, later Tokyo, from 1617 to 1958, and the various women who inhabited it. As this will be about what was considered the most popular quote, red light district of the city, this episode will most certainly not be for younger audiences, and the descriptions may not sit well with some listeners. However, my ultimate intention for this episode is to give a story to these many women who found themselves locked off from the rest of society, and for some buried in mass graves on account of their lack of wealth, forgotten by history in the process. By giving them a voice, I hope to preserve their memory and show that history is not just about remembering big events and giants in the past, but also the poorest and most maligned of society, showing that they matter too. Finally, the May episode will analyse the figure of King Hussein I of Jordan, born in 1935 and reigned from 1952 to his death in 1999, one of the most important individuals of 20th century Middle Eastern history. Jordan, for many Westerners, is largely forgotten, apart from the extraordinary city of Petra, which featured in the final scenes of 1989's Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Perhaps this can be viewed as a good thing, as this lack of name recognition demonstrates that Jordan is a country that has largely escaped the instability and conflict of other nations in the Middle East. At the same time, it is important to ask how Jordan got to its relatively stable position, and I believe that through the ruler of King Hussein I, we can explore the tightrope that Jordan walked from the 1950s to the 1990s, becoming the nation that it is today, as well as examining its often volatile relations with many of its neighbours. Just as I said in my first episode, it's going to be a long and fascinating journey, and I hope you can join me for the ride. Before finally bringing this episode to a close, I would like to thank all my listeners who joined in from a wide variety of countries over 2024, from Ireland, Spain, the United States, Italy, Mexico, Turkey, Hungary, the Netherlands, Bolivia, Canada, the United Kingdom, the Isle of Man, India, France and Australia. Thank you, Guramahagot, Gracias, Grazie, Teshikalar, Kuzunum, Guramiadid, Dan Yavadagalu, Mercy. And I want to wish all of you a happy Christmas and a pleasant New Year. As always, follow us on our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram and Blue Sky for the latest updates and images for each episode. And until next time, keep her lit.